You're watching Salina Media Connection. Michael Taylor, an associate professor of farm management at Kansas State University, gave a presentation on the farm economy Thursday, October 31st, 2019. The presentation took place at the Salina Country Club during the Salina Regional Economic Outlook Conference. The following presentation will last about 25 minutes.
Our next speaker is Michael Taylor. She's the assistant professor for farm management at Kansas State University. She'll provide an agricultural update. Michael.
Thank you, Matt. I forgot to tell you, Jeremy, I got promoted.
Oh.
I'm an associate professor now.
Okay.
Yeah, they can't fire you. So it's a pretty big deal. Let's see. Let's move on to the next slides. My name is Michael Taylor, and I work at Kansas State University in the Department of Agricultural Economics. And so my topic today for you is to talk a little bit about the Kansas farm economy, talk a little bit about rental rates for land and land values. How many of you work directly in the ag industry? Okay, we have a few. As the farmer goes, so goes the rural communities in Kansas, and so it's really important that we understand what's going on with farmers and with their incomes. So we'll talk about current economic conditions, and at any point in time, you're welcome to ask questions. I'm not going to make you wait till the end. This chart gives you a sense of what's been going on in farming for the last 20 years or so. It goes back to about 1990, to about 2000. And what you can see in the first, let's see, I'm just going to walk right over here. I know we're not supposed to, but this period right here is what we would call sort of the normal years. We lost a little bit of money on average, but some farms were making money and other farmers were not. Then all of a sudden commodity prices went up, and everybody, even the average farm, was making really good returns. And what do farmers spend their money on when they have money to spend? Land, equipment, pickups. I had one farmer try to tell me that he spent it on his wife, and I called bullshit. But then in 2014, commodity prices fell, and we started losing almost at the same rate that we were earning money. And we've been going along at that pace for the last 4 or 5 years. So we've got some problems. We had some working capital that we held over from those good years. If you weren't in a serious growth strategy and taking on a lot of new land during that period. But at some point, we're going to run into some problems if we keep having low commodity prices. This shows you net farm income per operator for farms and ranches. And what I want to point out to you is that 2018 number is right at about $100,000. And you would say if the net farm income was $100,000, that sounds pretty good, right? But let's take a look at how it varies across the state. And in north central Kansas, that number's about 80. In southwest Kansas, it was 180. And you'd say, well, how can there be that much variability in net farm income? We all face very similar prices, and we all face very similar cost of production. So what varies across the state that drives these differences in net farm income? Yield. Yields. The yield. Weather. How we did. And for some regions of the state, even with these low prices, we have had the yields to overcome it. If you've driven around the state and you've seen the large bags of grain on the ground, that's where we've put all of our excess grain for the last couple of years. We've had great yields in most of the state. And that has helped us to overcome some of these low prices. This is what else has helped. In 2018, net farm income was $100,000, but 38% of that net farm income came from government payments. It came from the farm bill payments that we knew we were going to have if we were enrolled in those programs, and it also came from the Market Facilitation Program, or the MFP program, which was President Trump's compensation for our participation in trade wars. Okay? We will get another round of MFP payments in 2019. So I think that 2019 is going to look fairly similar to 2018. It's 2020 that really scares me, because we aren't going to have those MFP payments, and we're going to be, again, facing lower commodity prices. And at some point in the state of Kansas, and I don't like saying this to a room full of farmers, but we're going to have a drought. We can't have good yields year after year after year after year. It doesn't work like that. So at some point, the combination will be too difficult to overcome. And what's happening, I think, for a lot of farms, this is one more thing that I want to point out to you, is that 21% of our farms made less than zero. They made negative profitability. And if you expand that category to the 0 to 50,000, then you have about 60% of our farms who made less than 50,000. So you look at averages, and that can be a little bit deceiving unless you look at the distribution of farms and how they, and so somebody got talked about farm size over here, and that's where that factors in, as well as management. But if 60% of my farms made less than $50,000 last year, what do you do when average farm family living expenses are sitting at about 70? You get another job. You get an off-farm job. And what is the one thing that you hope that that off-farm job has? Benefits. The insurance portion of farm family living expenses has been the fastest rising category. Okay? So that's what's facing a lot of farm families. Bankruptcies filed by Kansas farms are on an uptick. It's still a small number relative to the total number of farms, but it is a measure that we keep track of. You don't go bankrupt after one bad year. You build on several bad years. And so I think that these bankruptcy numbers will continue to go up. We do want to keep in perspective, this is not the 1980s. Okay, interest rates are not 18 and 19%. I don't know if any of you lived through the 80s and the damage that it did to local farms and local communities, but we're not experiencing that right now. So let's talk for just a minute about rental rates. When we reduce the profitability of farming, then we tend to reduce some machinery turnover. We like to have new equipment to farm with, but we can stretch that out for another year or two if we need to. We will change some of the use of our inputs, and we'll negotiate for lower rents on that farmland. 40% of the land that we farm is rented from someone else. Okay? So keep thinking that a large chunk of our ground, we don't own all the ground that we farm. And so we depend very heavily on rented ground. These are cash rents. They went up during the period of 2010 to 2015, and then they sort of stabilized. They didn't go back down. Now let me paint you a picture. Your landlady that you rent from, she's 75 years old, and she lives just down the road from you, and she's on a fixed income. And you told her 5-6 years ago, hey, I can raise your rent because we're doing really well with the farm. I can pay you more. How does that conversation go when you go back to her and say, well, I need to drop the rent because things aren't going very well? And that same landlady is paying higher property taxes because property taxes in the state of Kansas have been going up. So do rents fall easily? No, they're sticky. They stay up. These are rents, that's a really hard number to read, but what you can see is the orange and the red are the highest rents, the green are the lowest rents across the state, so you get a sense of where our best farmland is in the northeast Kansas. And then this is non-irrigated ground. Projected rental rates, I'm going to go through this real quick for you. So if I'm a farmer and I'm trying to figure out what I can pay for ground, I sit down with a budget and I say, this is what it's going to cost me to farm this ground. These are all the inputs, the seed, the fertilizer, the chemicals. This is what I'm going to put to it for machinery costs. And then they figure out what they expect prices are going to be and what they expect their yield is going to be, and they come up with a bottom line profit. And if they've already paid themselves for their labor and for their own machinery, then the profit that's left is what they can afford to pay for rent. Right? Okay, I'm going to show you some numbers. This is Salina County. In 2013 and 2014, I said, it looks like you can pay anywhere from $70 to $90. Let's just take 2014. I said, you can pay $90 an acre rent. We were paying about 60. So the farmers in the room gave me dirty looks, right? And the landowners in the room said, hey, that sounds pretty good. Well, 2014, we were still doing really well. You could pay that much. And the farmers are kind of funny. They don't like to talk in meetings. They just sit and they stare at you. But then when you're having coffee afterwards, they'll come up to you and they'll say, well, you know, I just want you to know that on new contracts that I'm bidding on, I am paying that much to get new ground. And I'm like, well, thanks for supporting me during the meeting. Then look at how far it fell in 2017. It fell all the way to $22. And I said, you can afford to pay $22. When we get out into western Kansas, these calculations go down to less than 10 bucks. I said, that's what you can afford to pay. But didn't I just paint you a picture of going to your landlady and how that's not going to work? And she's going to tell you, I can't drop the rent that much. So what happens is farmers continue to pay the rent that they agreed to, but they're not paying themselves for their owned machinery, or they're not paying themselves for their labor, or both. So they're moving dollars around to make it work. The other group that you need to think about are our young producers. When you first get into farming, you don't buy farmland. You rent it. And you probably rent it from family. Older producers tend to have land portfolios that are dominant owned land, lesser rented land. Young producers have portfolios that are dominant rented land. If I'm an older producer and I have a lot of owned land, well, the thing is if I don't make a profit on my owned land this year, that's not good, but it's okay because I can still afford to pay rent on the ground that I've got. If I'm a young producer and I rent almost all of my ground and I don't make a profit off of it, I still have to pay rent on all of that ground. Do you see how it becomes a challenge for those younger producers? I always tell them, go to your dad, who you're renting ground from, and say, look, we need to talk about lowering the rent because somehow I'm going to have to either lower the rent or lower family living expenses, and that means moving back in with you. Let's talk land values, because that's what happens. Land values are a carryover of what we can afford to pay for ground. USDA said that from 18 to 19, our land values went up by 4.9%. I disagree with that number. I will show you some numbers in a minute that suggest that at best it was flat. This is survey-based data, so they send out a survey to everyone and they say, what do you think is going on with agricultural land values in your area? And to be honest, if you haven't been buying or selling ground lately, you probably don't have a real good idea. We are a non-disclosure state, so when a piece of ground sells, you can't just go find out what everybody got, what they sold their ground for. Only realtors and appraisers can do that. It said we're up 5% on pasture. Again, I think that's pretty robust, more so than what we saw. This is how Kansas land values have gone up over the last 10 years or so. And you can see the non-irrigated, irrigated, and pasture here. This is the rent to land value ratio. Basically, rents didn't change enough, but land values went up, so it pushed that rent to value ratio down. So I'm going to show you some market-based land values. I have data from the property valuation department in Topeka, and what I do is I ask them for transactions on all the pieces of ground that were marked as agricultural land. And so it's like looking at the MLS data, but it's for agricultural land purchases. And we look at that, and we have 15 to 18 sales data. We know county location and population density, which matters. We know the acres in the sale. Large parcels tend to sell for less on a dollar per acre basis than smaller parcels. Mixture of irrigated, non-irrigated, and pasture. 20-year average rainfall. It's interesting to me, I come from Montana, and so when I look at land values in Kansas, I think to myself, why did you ever leave Donovan County, right? You should have just stayed. They are so optimistic about the amount of rain that they get in southwest Kansas that they still give out rain gauges at farmer meetings. And I think that's true optimism. enrollment in the Conservation Reserve Program, which is where you set aside your land and you get paid a fixed amount from the government. Value of improvements is removed for a bare land value, and parcels under 40 acres are omitted because we figured that those are more likely to be developed than they are to stay in ag. And so this is something that I wanted to show you is we have approximately 33 sales per county. That's good because I'm going to estimate a county level number, and I'll tell you where to find those numbers if you're interested. But the other thing that I want to show you, and I think, yes, I have this slide. In 2015, we hadn't really decided that we were in a bad farm economy yet. Commodity prices had fallen, but we had so many good years that we figured we were going to recover. And so when it came to selling land, we were still willing to bid on it. We still had transactions. By 2016, people said, look, land prices are starting to fall, and I'm not willing to let go of my land for that. So we saw a big contraction in the number of sales. I can't see no sales. When you go to an auction and the last bidder's bid is not accepted by the seller, that's a really good indication of supply and demand. I unfortunately can't look at those, but I can look at the number of total transactions. Now we've recovered almost to 2015 levels by 2018, and what I think is happening is that we're in a situation where more and more people have to sell their land. Why do you have to sell your land? Well, because your bank has called you in and said we need to restructure your loans. We need to take them from short-run loans where they're just, maybe you pay them off at the end of the year, and restructure them into 15-year notes. But in order to make that work and make those payments doable, we're going to ask you to sell off 80 acres. And in that case, you can't say, I'm not going to accept that last bid at auction. You go ahead and you take it. And so sales transactions are up. What I have seen from 2015 to 2018 is a 21% decline in land values statewide. Depending, I will admit, local land markets are local, okay? If you get a piece of ground and you put it up for sale between two farmers who have been dying to get a hold of that piece of ground for the last 30 years, it's going to sell really well. But in general, we have a situation where land values have gone down. It's the same for all the categories. They've gone down 27% on irrigated land, and on pasture a little bit less, and on 18% decline. This is a chart that I like to show. This is Iowa versus Kansas. And when you put them on the same scale, Kansas doesn't look like it's done very much, but if I adjust it so that it's on its own axis, that's what land values, that's the pattern of land values in Kansas versus Iowa. What happened was, in the 1960s, we were on a low and slow, steady rate of growth. We got into the 70s, and we started to go up. And the 1970s were very good for farming, okay? Then the 1980s happened. Interest rates went up, the Russian grain embargo happened, and we're in a situation where we started to see land being sold off. Farm credit, we know them today. They sold off a lot of farms that they foreclosed on, and we saw a big drop off in land values. What gets me is we went back to a slow and steady rate of growth for quite a long time, and then look at this. This is what $7 corn will do to farmland values. And to be honest with you, if the farmers were still the ones buying it, and even if they weren't the ones buying it, there were people in the communities that were saying, hey, we're making so much money off of farming, we'll gladly come and buy that ground if the farmer won't. Now, we've fallen back, but my biggest concern, and what I had, I'll close on this, is that we talked to some ag lenders a couple of weeks ago, and we talked to them and said, what proportion of your loan portfolio would you describe as vulnerable? And I didn't define vulnerable. I just wanted them to tell me, what they thought. And I was expecting between 5 and 10%. And I got responses that were 25%, 30%, 35%, 60%. And it was basically saying, look, anybody in ag, we're running out of working capital from the good years, and we're not cash flowing these years right now. And so what do? It's going to be tight for a couple more years. That's the situation. It's going to be tight for a couple more years. It's going to be hard for some of these farms to keep going. But I will say this, Kansas farmers are resilient. And we will still be growing wheat, so don't worry about being a shocker. It's still cool in some circles. Sorry, K-State. We will still be growing wheat, corn, beans, milo. We will still be an ag state. But I think for a couple more years, we will have a tough road to hoe. Okay? So any questions? Yes, sir.
What's happening to the average size of a Kansas farm, like a 4-acre farm type thing?
It's going up. The average size of a Kansas farm is going up. The average size of a U.S. farm is going up.
From what to what?
Well, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but yes, Kansas farms are getting bigger, and it makes sense economically because we continue to need to be the low-cost producer. And low-cost producers, especially in the rural parts of Kansas, commercial agriculture is what we do. And so you have to be the low-cost producer, and taking on more land and being more efficient with the land that you work and more efficient with your machinery costs by having more land allows you to keep those costs down. Now there's a labor question there of having the labor to be able to work those extra acres, but if you can do that, that's fine. There are small farms in the Kansas City metro area, in Lawrence, in Wichita that are growing for direct markets. So there is a group of farmers that can be small and can direct market to consumers, but the vast majority of Kansas farms are looking at having to get bigger and more efficient in order to stay in the game. Well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
I've got a question for you.
I don't know.
What can you tell a non-farm group what's going on in Farm Bill?
Can I tell a non-farm group what's going on with the Farm Bill? Yes, so we passed it, and we are in the process of signing up for farm programs. And the interesting thing about the Farm Bill is that when you look at the budget for the Farm Bill, 3/4 of it goes to SNAP, okay? And 1/4 of it goes to what we would call farm programs. The biggest chunk of that quarter that goes to farm programs actually goes to the crop insurance program, okay? Which is different than the direct farm payments that I showed you earlier. The direct farm payments are coming based off of if it's a low price, then it triggers a payment, or if we have low returns at the county level, it triggers a payment. Crop insurance, on the other hand, is a public-private partnership where you buy insurance on your crop for the yields that you have historically proven. And that program is very well liked by Kansas farmers, and they did a lot to maintain that program in the 2018 Farm Bill, so it's largely intact. But that's a big safety net for them is crop insurance. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Associate Professor Taylor, for your presentation.
That was a presentation by K-State Professor Michael Taylor on the Kansas farm economy. You're watching Salina Media Connection.